This is the DRF Players Podcast. Here are your hosts, Peter Thomas Fornatel and Jonathan Kinchin.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Players Podcast. This is show 384, the November 13th, 2018 edition. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatel, back with you in the Brooklyn bunker. If you hear dog chain jingling throughout the show, which you will, that's Muggsy the handicapping Labrador alongside. Couple of special guests this week. Before we get to them, I will introduce my co-host. He is back from, I don't know, would you call it a successful trip to Del Mar? He did run 19th after all. I'll let him tell you what his bankroll was to get that 19th place finish. I'm talking about the People's Champion, Jonathan Kinchin. JK, what's up?
Absolutely, 19th place with 90 cents. I texted the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge champion Chuck Grubbs this morning. He was 20th place with 80 cents. I said, hey, buddy, you won the BCBC, but I won this battle.
Tremendous stuff, JK. The Del Mar contest ultimately went to Mark Strife, laconic individual, but a fantastic contest player in his own right. Got to get a real interview with him. I got a few words one time and considered that a win, but I'll get him to open up at some point and we'll do something fun with him. But very impressive, turning 1,300 into 90,000 in the last race of the contest. But JK, we're not here today to talk about the Del Mar Betting Challenge. We're here to talk about the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge. I envisioned this show shortly after all the Michigas last year and the announcement of the Players Committee and the idea that I was so pleased to hear the Breeders' Cup taking the problems seriously that happened last year and forming the Players Committee with an eye towards fixing the rules and publishing the plays of the players involved. And all the way back then, the kernel of an idea, wouldn't it be fun if after next year's BCBC, instead of doing a couple of hours on what went wrong, we can talk about what went right? And that's what we're going to do on today's show. We're going to have a couple of special guests to help us do that. Coming up a little bit later on, we're going to have Pat Cummings of the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation. Pat been absolutely killing it on Twitter, releasing snippets of things that he finds interesting in the plays. We're going to be able to draw him out about what he's noticed, spending time looking over who played what at this year's BCBC. But before we get to that, I want to introduce somebody I've wanted to have on for quite a while, software engineer Robin Howlett. Robin is the one who took the PDF file released by Breeders' Cup and turned it into a searchable database in spreadsheet form, and he has some very cool observations as well. So we're going to start off with Robin, and then we'll bring in Pat. But let's get to my earlier conversation with Robin Howlett. And now I'd like to welcome to the DRF Players Podcast for his first appearance, hopefully of many, on the show, software engineer Robin Howlett. Robin, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, before we get into talking about this very cool work you've done with the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge plays, for the uninitiated, I wanted to give some idea of who you are and your connection to horse racing. I first heard of you in conjunction with the short-lived but very cool handicapper software. How did that come about? And give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Ireland. I moved to the U.S. About 8 years ago through marriage. I settled in Colorado. And, I had an interest in horse racing most of my life. Both sides of my family, it was a popular sport and activity to attend and follow. Had a cousin who was a jockey. So I was a horse racing fan. But when I moved to the U.S., just being confronted with the amount of data, and I wanted to follow, in essence, the U.S. circuits rather than European, I just realized how much I didn't know. And most of the time, it's just, before you can really understand a race or understand opportunities, it's just simply, okay, what is the full context of what I'm looking at? So I had tried a few different ways to kind of educate myself, books and online forums, things like that. But ultimately, the data was where I wanted to kind of lead me down different paths. And I noticed that there were some PDF charts available via Equibase. I started to see, could I extract some information from that and put it into a spreadsheet or a database or what have you. And then it just became kind of a fun hobby side project for a while, for about 18 months. And I realized I was able to do something, pretty interesting. I wanted to kind of say, well, here's a chart and here's some information you could extract out of it, and do it in a way that was as friendly as possible to even non-technical users. So that became an app called Handicapper. As you said, got some feedback from the data source and said, we'd rather not have this out there. So I pulled it. But, what I learned from that was just a familiarity with horse racing data to begin with. And then it actually opened me up in my profile to the community. And really since then, I've enjoyed just, a burgeoning relationship with people, learning even more. And it feels like we're in a pretty good time for racing right now when it comes to educational materials. There's some great podcasts like yourself and others. And I'd like to continue to contribute more, new types of tools to the community so that, situations like the BCBC isn't just, a PDF printout of bets, that maybe we can turn it into something a little bit more interesting.
That's great. And thank you for including us as a part of the solution, not part of the problem when it comes to horse racing data. Before we move on from Handicapper completely, I do want to ask, is there one lesson or one thing you learned being able to parse the data through that app that stood out to you as beneficial, either in terms of your form study or something about the industry at large?
Well, yeah, in many ways, it's. I think if I didn't have that, I probably wouldn't even be doing things like the BCBC and spreadsheets and things like that. Mostly because you need to be aware of what are all the variations of information out there in a horse race. So, like I said, in Europe, even just knowing, how the claiming style structure works in the U.S. and now how that feeds into other races. The payoffs, the exotic betting structure over here is really not replicated at all in Europe either. So really, if I wanted to contribute it in a meaningful and probably understandable way for U.S. racing fans, I needed to kind of set that context. And it, the scope and breadth of the U.S., where the race tracks were, how often they would race. What does a year look like? I remember once speaking about that in terms of betting opportunities. What day of the week, which tracks are well positioned for, getting attention because they're good betting products and they're not being smothered by a major racetrack. So really, I felt it just kind of gave me a much richer understanding of the sport in the U.S. Technically, it was always going to be, just a side thing. I probably knew it wasn't going to be long-lived. Somebody would have issue with it. But yeah, I'll probably say I'm most likely going to bring it back into the public domain with official data sources, probably starting with Brisnet. And, really I want to kind of put it back out there so people can still use a very friendly tool and probably a data science introduction tools between databases and spreadsheets and maybe some other interesting things I'm messing around with. So, there's a lot of data. You need to be able to understand it, and I think it doesn't always have to be a handicapping product. It can be just something, a data visualization or a data exploration tool.
I know that you came to the attention as a result of this work of our friends at the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation, one of whom will be elsewhere on this podcast, Pat Cummings. And I know that you definitely seem to have an interest in promoting the health of the industry as a whole by taking on projects such as the one you described of looking at optimal factors that go into tracks having success, some of which might be counterintuitive. What, if anything, can you talk about the work you've done with the TIF and these type of industry health and growth issues?
Oh, mostly it's been conversational. Pat was nice enough to give me a call, and we exchanged some ideas. They have a quite a grand vision and a big goal of really trying to influence the sport, really at the industry and executive level. I'm probably more from, the outside and fairly independent and don't have many connections. But, through my experience in handicapper and just greater engagement with others on social media, etc., I've been able to catch the ear of a few people. In my opinion, generally, I would say I probably put myself forward as a technologist first. I kind of believe that many types of entertainment products and other scenarios, even your day job, can be improved by better and more efficient uses of technology. For horse racing, the sport, with now sports betting starting to be rolled out across the country, you have just a wider range of entertainment options available. By its very nature, you're going to have to create your own elbow room now to get some attention. I think horse racing, for my interest, I would love to be able to bring horse racing to the interest of people who maybe hadn't considered it before. And I think even things like the BCBC and really those recent panels, some of which you hosted at EquestriCon that were wagering focused, they highlighted the fact that as a betting game, horse racing continues to differentiate itself. And you can really express some very interesting ways of earning money, of gaining edge. You can get into quite sophisticated discussions about, both game theory and risk management, bankroll management, all these kinds of things. Versus, when I look at sports betting, and again, I'm somewhat new to this space, picking one side of a line, 55% versus 45 or even less than that, I think for those looking for more sophistication, horse racing shouldn't be afraid of confronting that. I think in many ways they should embrace that, and be it technology tools as ubiquitous as spreadsheets and databases, you can really enjoy the sport below the surface level, and you can realize that there's a considerable amount of intellectual challenges available.
Absolutely. The best gambling game in the world, I believe, and so much to unpack from what you were just talking about. On one hand, just to button up what we were talking about, the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation, when I heard Craig Bernick originally describe the goals, he specifically mentioned Nate Silver and his work as an exemplar of what he'd like to be. And for that to work, you not only need the connected industry insider types, you not only need the people like Pat who can communicate the message effectively, you also need the quant. You also need people who can use technology tools to make sense of the data. And I love the idea that someone such as yourself is willing to fill that role. And I think it's ultimately going to make their mission achievable thanks to your hard work. And I do want to pivot to talk about the BCBC. Of course, the data finally released of all the plays in the contest, complicated backstory there that folks who read my work will be familiar with. But aside from the fact that I believe publishing the plays provides the transparency that this contest needed to continue to thrive after the events of last year, I also am very intrigued by the idea that these plays can be a teaching tool. How did you first become aware of the plays being released, and why did you decide to use your talents to show them to the world in a more easy to understand way?
Sure. So I became aware on Twitter. I think I may have seen a retweet by Nick Tomorrow or somebody like that, but if I was aware that they were going to be published, I'd forgotten, quite frankly. So when I saw it, I was quite interested. And, it was a 900-plus page document. And PDFs, while very useful for scanning and viewing information, obviously don't lend themselves to analysis. So I was already naturally familiar with extracting information from PDFs. So, I said I'd give it a shot. And I guess I was pleasantly surprised that I was able to make progress pretty quick. And that evening I put the kids to bed, got home, sat down, and 2-3 hours later I had something functional. And maybe to be expected, it was also the data required a bit of cleanup and standardization. So that was really the last couple of hours was getting that out there and pretty. Once it was there, really, I'm kind of looking at this from fresh eyes. I'm not a tournament player, and really even just the concept of a $10,000 buy-in would be eye-watering to me. So it's kind of just a fascination of, okay, if you were to put up you risk this amount of capital, how would you approach it? How would you play it? And how people would they play to win? It's a little bit different versus a poker tournament, that whatever profit you make, you get to keep and bring home. And then you have kind of in the money type calculations when you're shooting for a score. So at first it was just simply, okay, what does this tell me? And I guess there's also a factor just like, how scary is this to a regular fan? Like, is this going to be extremely complicated type of betting, or will the strategy be really kind of not clear at all, or maybe I'll be puzzled by some of the moves? But my feeling is it runs the full gamut. Certainly you see that some people hit some really big scores, and that's what led them to being top 5, top 10. Then you see some people who took a completely different approach, and they also finished quite highly. And I think where the spreadsheet kind of shows its value is highlighting those who, for instance, took a shot and it didn't work out. Who did something really interesting, who had the potential to really blow everyone out of the water, but their numbers didn't land. And I think seeing others like what Tony Zhou was visualizing, what he's kind of showing is probably the more advanced kind of game theory approaches. And can you analyze the field and see how, as a field, did they approach this event? Which ones did they gravitate towards, and which ones did they maybe avoid? And are there opportunities therefore to go in a more independent streak in future? So I think there's lots to unpack. I wouldn't, if I was one, I'm mostly unfamiliar with the majority of these players, so forgive me if I overlook somebody. But no, I thought it was a pretty fascinating data set, and it's up there now on a spreadsheet, and I think that's the right tool to really dive into this.
One of the things that strikes me looking through some of the plays is efficiency versus inefficiency in wagers put together. Now, I don't mean to attach judgment to that. It could be in a tournament like the BCBC with these big fields with such good horses that casting a wide net within your wagers might be a way to catch something and have it work out. But it is fascinating how some players, to a point where I can almost not even understand how narrow the numbers they decided to use were, constructed wagers differently. There's so much when you gave that overview of what you thought you might find. It's definitely, for me, a case of all of the above. Is there another player or specific play that stood out to you as something that you might be able to learn something from or had questions about?
Yeah, well, I probably give the caveat that I don't know what was going through each person's mind and the strategic decisions they were making. So I don't want necessarily to prompt people to say this is why they did this or that. But, I mean, number one, I would start with just the first two finishers. I mean, Chuck Grubbs, made the majority of his money on the last race. He hit the trifecta in the Breeders' Cup Classic. But maybe just as interestingly, or maybe even more so, Ed Abel, who finished second, made the vast majority of his money on win-place show bets. Yep. And I mean, when I first saw that there was $29,000 plus on Accelerate win-place show. I guess I would not expect second place in the BCBC to be dominated by that type of bet. That payoff as well. If that was all just win bets instead, he would have won. But I don't know the reason behind that thinking. Further down, I mean, certainly some people who hit big scores early on seem to take quite a conservative approach. Who remained up in the top leaderboard. Ryan Muller hit a huge trifecta in the juvenile turf sprint. Got a payoff of 700 plus to 1. But then, in essence, apart from maybe a near miss in the mile, just kind of paid it off and finished. I think it was 4th or 5th. The ones that really interested me were like where I felt there was an obvious degree of plan playing out. I think your partner Jonathan Tinchin, had really. I would probably recommend people to look at that. he went big. He took that big shot from the Turf Classic daily doubles. I think $20,000 on Enable, and probably looking at Catholic Boy, Ishida, a couple others. I can't remember exactly who it was, but the way he had set it up from doubles earlier on Newspaper Record and Jaywalk, for them other opportunities, I thought that was nicely played out and well managed. And then, I mean, ultimately, if you're hitting tries and exactas, you were probably doing well. And I think there's some probably bigger names that took a shot and really, if they connected, would have had some pretty big scores. So Christian Helmers really went big on Mendelssohn in the Classic and keyed him in a lot of spots in exotics, and as well as I think maybe almost $20,000 in win bets too. So had all of those hit, or had that hit, that scenario, I mean, he'd be well into the six figures, I would imagine, from that payoff.
And it was a great play.
Graham,
he ran a winning race too. To give credit to Christian, figure we talk about on the show from time to time. I mean, the horse ran a winning race, very bold and unlucky not to get there. What struck you about Marshall's play?
Well, I guess in many ways it opens us up to the reality that some people have multiple entries, and so they are naturally balancing their risk exposure and opportunities across those tickets. So with the spreadsheet also allows you to filter on that and kind of see how to combine. I think a very naive takeaway is just you're never really out of it. Marshall, who finished fifth with $52,000 plus, he had $720 going into the distaff, and that's just interesting because you often kind of think you're down and out of it when you're down to your last few $100s, but these opportunities still exist. I think there was an even more extreme example. Alan Harburg had $450 going into the turf, and he hit a major trifecta there. So, yeah, there are really interesting ways to balance. I think trifectas, exactas, and win bets dominated. Daily doubles shortly behind. Like I said, you could get to a significant position with any combinations of those. And I think if I was to say there was scenarios where I really couldn't understand, I think actually I updated the spreadsheet yesterday and added a new column where you could see the amount bet per race per player. Eric Moomey was somebody who did a daily double in the turf. I think over $45,000 worth of bet of daily doubles from Turf Classic, with seemingly maybe 20, 25 different combinations of daily doubles.
It was basically an enable.
I'd be hoping some expertise could help and decipher that. Because
it was an enable lay. The play was basically an enable lay from what I could see. In other words, just playing various combinations against her, trying to do better than double up. I mean, I hope significantly better. I haven't done all the math on it, but I mean, if in fact Magical had gotten there, he would have been in an unbelievable position. Of course, we can debate the wisdom of trying to take on Enable, but hey, maybe as close as it was in the end, from a strict value for money perspective, you can make a case that it was a bold move that just didn't work out. But that's how I saw that one. It's really fascinating. And then the other funny thing about the Moomey entry is, of course, all the controversy last year when he was disqualified for across 4 entries under his control, combining them in the juvenile turf. This year, completely within the rules, with his own 2 entries, combining them in the juvenile turf. He's got a very simple angle there, which apparently boils down to bet the European runners. But hey, it worked out. It worked out for him when Line of Duty got to the line first. But if you have any others like that, I'd love to have this be a dialogue, not necessarily on this show, but as a conversation going forward. I'd love to try to figure out what was going on in some of these instances, because I do think there's a lot that we can learn by looking at these plays. And again, it's a great benefit of sort of not the reason why the plays were published necessarily, but a terrific side product a side effect of the plays being published is it's a learning tool and something that players will be able to look at and help shape their own strategies. For me, and I'm sure we'll talk about this elsewhere on this show, so much of it comes down to your wagering personality, as we've talked about before. I believe, depending on what your goals are, you could make a case that large place and show wagers might make sense on a stage like this, with the potential, despite the hit you take with breakage, etc., the ability to, if you're not necessarily looking to win but get up into the prize pool, you could probably craft a strategy to do that without taking all that much risk, knowing you're getting an overlay, because the money in the prize pool should theoretically counterbalance the effects of the takeout. On the other hand, you see the different ways that people approach it and how they make it work for them. It's fascinating, and I thank you on behalf of all the listeners, Robin, for the work you did making this data so much easier to understand.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and I'm really interested to see what else comes out of it. And ultimately, it is a tournament, so it's people playing that game as opposed to particularly the races and horses. I thought it was quite fascinating. I'm glad the Breeders' Cup did it, and I'm really interested to see what else comes out of it.
That is such a good point. It's not necessarily a blueprint. A lot of the tactics that, say, Jonathan uses, or Dick Girardi, who made a very large play on Marley's Freedom that didn't work out. These are plays that make perfect sense in the context of a contest with the extra money that one can win in the form of the prize pool. They don't so much make sense in crafting everyday wagers, but I would imagine that if you look closely enough at the way that trifectas are organized, for example, or double bets are placed, there probably is some signal in there that will help you in your everyday cash play. Do you agree with that with that idea that there is some value in it despite the game within a game element of the contest?
I think so. I mean, number one, you're confronted with there's plenty of games or plenty of races available early that people were probably designing bets a little bit more conservatively, and we're trying to build bankrolls. So we're trying to look for value and opportunity. Once you get into the latter half of the second day, the right people were making the big swings, and that I can understand. You wouldn't necessarily take that as a learning. But no, if anything, probably one of my takeaways was I think a lot of people maybe didn't swing as big as they could have. Some of the payoffs were probably pretty widespread tickets, small winnings here and there, even late into the game on Saturday. So I think it's an opportunity for every level of player to just get exposure. I think there's clear maybe top players in the game, and this is a very rare treat to be able to see how they played a major live bankroll tournament. And then there's just simply, what were the horses people were looking at, and were there ones people had identified, and not only had they identified that they were good value, but they actually had structured their wagers for, both respecting the contest and maybe extracting the most value that they could. I think many people will be able to point at lots of individual wagers and say, this was a good one, and this is one I probably want to understand a little bit more.
Another thing that struck me looking through relates to what you just said. I think you're being a little kind about how there are some wagers that are almost seem timid. To give those players credit, maybe their goal was sneak into the top 15 and get an NHC seat as opposed to participating high up in the price pool. But it does strike me looking through that there is a significant number of, what were there in the end, 393 entries, a significant number of them that don't seem to be interested in winning the whole thing. And when you consider the money that's at the top of the tournament, that really strikes me that if you are someone who's willing to treat the bankroll not like bankroll, if you're willing to ignore the fact that you can walk away with your unused chips at the end and willing to just fire it aggressively at the top spot, there's probably equity, because I'm not convinced there's more than 50 or 60 entries or 50 or 60 individuals who actually have a realistic chance to win the thing. Does that sound like an aggressive number to you, or do you think I might be onto something?
No, that would certainly appear fair. Ultimately, if you're ending the tournament with money, you clearly haven't risked it all. And I think in many ways, what we kind of said was you weren't even out of it if you were down to your last few $100s, 2 or 3 races from the end. So, everybody has different comfort levels and different reasons for what they made, the decisions that they made. But ultimately, the prize money is so strong and can factor into the payoff calculations and your opportunities. I think those who I recognize from tournament play, etc., who surely must be some of the more well-respected players, they certainly demonstrated very clear convictions that, I'm going to go after this. I'm going to, if I connect, my opinion is right, I'm going to make a score in a major way. And not only will I, receive the profits from my bets, but I have now the opportunity for some major prize money as well. And I think this certainly those in maybe the latter half or latter 2/3 of the lineup may examine just exactly, how aggressive were they? Where could they have made a more interesting play? And I would probably say it would be very interesting to see next year how the tournament develops and how people will manage their money.
Absolutely. This is a lot for players to chew on. A couple other factors to consider. There were players in the event, including the Helmers entry we were talking about before, with not just the $500,000 score of winning the whole thing, but $1 million on top of that. Certainly those players with the $1 million bonus attached to their name had extra reason to be super aggressive. And then also just to underline, I don't think you're playing wrong to go there and say, hey, I'm going to try to get up into the lower rungs of the prize pool. I just don't think from just a strictly equity point of view, that's the way to get the most out of your dollar. But at the end of the day, it comes down to wagering personality. If you're somebody who's going to bet that kind of money on the 2 days of the Breeders' Cup, I still think even if you're going to lay up at the end, you're better off doing it in the context of the contest and maybe getting some money out of the deal or a seat to the NHC or whatever. I don't mean to attach judgment to the numbers I was throwing out there before. I just wanted to make that clear for some of the listeners. Robin, I've taken more of your time than I said I was going to, but before I let you go, do you have a closing thought about this year's BCBC or your ongoing involvements in the data side of the horse racing industry?
Well, I mean, the BCBC, it's very interesting for someone like me. I still feel like I'm learning the intricacies of the sport and the wagering side of things, and even just contests were a fairly new concept for certainly in the last few years. I'm interested in just, if anybody else is using this information and learn something interesting or wants to build on top of it, I'd encourage those to share. Twitter is a great place to do that. It distributes among the community fairly quickly. And I'd love to be able to have that, some satisfaction that some other education is happening. Going forward, my own efforts, like I said, I'd like to have Handicapper back out there again, just as a simple introductory tool that allow people use these types of technologies to explore horse racing data. And then going forward, I'm really not quite sure, but I would love to hear from anybody who wants to try out something, even has an idea and not quite sure how they're going to do it. I'm more than happy to lend an ear, and if I can lend a hand, I'll be glad to do it as well.
Love your attitude, Robin. Thank you so much. Everyone should be following you on Twitter. It's just your name, easy enough. Early adopter, I'm guessing, at Robin Howlett, and that's RobinHowlett. Thanks again for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, for our next segment on this edition of the DRF Players Podcast, as promised, we're going to bring in Pat Cummings of the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation. Pat, what attracted you in the first place to take a deeper look at these plays coming out of the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge?
Well, Pete, it's just fascinating, really. I kind of was reflecting on it as it had happened, and I thought to myself, I think this is the first time in the history of pari-mutuel wagering in North America that we've ever seen plays presented in such a fashion. Now, granted, it's within the confines of the contest, and they're not really reflective of how someone would play on an ordinary basis. I get that. But this is the first time that the public is really getting light into a large number of people who are betting a very significant horse racing event and all trying to do a certain, they're trying to accomplish something. That insight has never been gleaned in a kind of a mass data dump format. And I was just like, wow, this is a first time event that this has ever really happened. I just thought it was fascinating, insightful, and as a sport, just something very positive and engaging.
That's a great way of looking at it. Now, everybody knows about the world's biggest Tony Joe fan, not least because he's the only person I know, JK, who listens to our show on 2.0 times speed. So when he listens to the DRF Players podcast, he doesn't hear PTF and JK. He hears a couple of chipmunks. And that does amuse me to no end. But it was a rare situation where Tony and I had some disagreements on Twitter the other day. And I think we don't have to rehash the whole argument. You can go back and find that thread and take a look. Obviously, I'm at Looms Boldly. Tony, I think, is at Implied Vol, but if you go through my tweets and responses, you'll be able to find this whole conversation. But he had some concerns about players maybe being embarrassed by their plays. I know that was one that came up. How convinced are you, JK, that the release of the plays is a net good, and why?
I'm absolutely convinced that it's a net good. Obviously, for the we talked about it at EquestriaCon on our panel. Obviously, for the just to have some transparency, just to make sure everything's on the up and up. There's a lot of money involved in this contest, and so allowing that, based on what we saw last year, allowing the peanut gallery to kind of take a peek in and make sure that everything's working good, and everyone's doing the right thing. I think that was an important part of it. But I think just like the discussion's been fun. The discussion of looking and seeing what people did, taking a look at what people did. And, for me, I think that, to Tony's point, if you're embarrassed about your play, then, that's kind of the tough love you need to improve your game as a horse player. If you're doing things that you are embarrassed about, then improve them. No one's saying that, no one's trying to be judgy here, but, look, if you did something silly, try to learn from those mistakes and know better, do better.
Tony also made the point that in an ideal world, rather than crowdsourcing the uncovering of possible wrongdoing, there'd just be very clear rules about what can and cannot be done. Yes, but in the real world, that's just not realistic. And to me, by knowing that the plays are going to be out there in the world in and of itself is such a deterrent, and should problematic patterns emerge, then rules could be codified based on those. It's just kind of a no-brainer to me, especially on the heels of last year when this tournament, I personally had to convince several players, no, they fixed it. You can play this year. Just because it went wrong last year doesn't mean you can't play. There were a lot of players who weren't willing at first to participate based on all the craziness from last year, the accusations and the player being disqualified. And I think that this was just a terrific step towards restoring confidence in the event. And to Pat's point, a great way for players to learn. We've talked with Robin, we've talked with Pat. They both made the same point. You have to keep in mind there's a game within a game going on here. This isn't the way you're going to approach even just a big Saturday in your cash play. Plays in this tournament are being made with the knowledge that finishing very high is going to give you an outsized reward. So to me, what that means is when you're looking over at these plays, players are going to be more aggressive than they are in real life as a result of that. There's also a limited opportunity of this set of races. So players are going to presumably be playing more, trying to preserve their bankroll in service of the rules of this contest. You have to keep that in mind. But I still feel that when you look at the specifics of the way bets are constructed, you can learn something that would help your everyday cash play. And I definitely think when it comes to figuring out how to play in other live bank contests, you can get even more meat off the bone when it comes to looking at these plays. Pat, we'll start with you with a very simple one. Who's a player who struck you in the way that he or she constructed his wagers throughout this event that you think folks could learn something from?
Well, I was very, moved would be the best word, with the play of Christian Helmers, who I thought, he's had success in this tournament before. But, it's very simple to go through either with what Robin did or just pulling up the document that BCBC put out and just do a search, and you can very easily find it. But it becomes very clear how Christian plays and how tight he structures his plays and what that could potentially yield him if he's right. And, one example of this was in the juvenile fillies, where his basic main play was to get Vibrance third. And he structured a winning trifecta play. He only had 2 tickets on the entire race on his main entry. The entry that, on one of his entries, he had 2 tickets. But it was just solely focused on 4 horses over 4 horses with Vibrance. Now, Vibrance is a 30-1 chance. Okay, so you have this long shot that you're thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to behave? What do I see here? He played incredibly tight, 4 over 4 with a single to come in third. He's saying, I only think Vibrance can run third on that entry. And sure enough, she does. On a second entry, he plays exact as with her in second. So he's basically saying, if she were to run second, I've got that covered, and I've got 250 to win under if she were to come in first. And I've if you go through the plays, you can see this format coming from a variety of players who are trying to maximize an opinion on a single, what I'll just call, for lack of a better word, long shot. Okay, they're not always these huge prices, but they're trying to maximize a single opinion. And if they're right, it's going to become very rewarding for them. And you will see that throughout the play that there are sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, Christian pulled in on the juvenile fillies a nearly a $20,000 trifecta score, which put him in great position. And he continued to play in that same fashion going into the second day of the tournament. And as has been discussed here on this show before and discussed amongst players and online, many times you are simply trying to put yourself in the best position for the Classic to take that shot. And Christian sure as heck did. And that $21,000 in that kind of first main entry on the Classic and was really focused on Mendelssohn. He had, I think, about $17,000 to win on Mendelssohn. He had a big exactas. If Accelerate beats Mendelssohn, he has the exacta for, I think, more than $2,000. So, there was just it's that really very attentive structure, very tight, very focused structure that I thought it's incredibly clean, and it's just a very attractive way of playing in these type of contests. And the other thing that becomes fairly notable is he very rarely is betting a horse to win. He is betting for big scores and to be very focused. And if he can be very right, it's going to turn out for him. And I thought that play from someone like Christian Helmers, who of course has done so well in this tournament in the past, the way he played in this tournament, I thought was, to be able to see it in paper was really fun.
Twice second, of course, at the BCBC was Christian. We talked about, funny enough, he was another one of the players who struck Robin as well, and we talked about how good that opinion was, really. Mendelssohn, absolutely, when you take pace figures into account, running a winning race. Another point I made about Christian, the fact that he was playing not only for the $500,000 for winning the BCBC, but the $1 million bonus. Yet another reason to be super aggressive in that spot. He may be responsible for some of the most boring content in the history of YouTube, but he's a fine live bankroll player. There's no denying that. JK, your thoughts on the Helmers plays?
I thought he was sharp, but I've never really questioned Christian as a horse player. I think he always, I think he gets it. I think there's guys that understand how to maximize the value in these contests, and there's guys that, in the nicest possible way I can say, are kind of like dead money. They're not going to win. They can't win. They don't play to win. They don't try to win. They don't structure their bets efficiently enough to win. They're just kind of in there churning their money, waiting to bleed out. Christian's not one of those guys. He never really has been. So it was definitely interesting to see that. I love the play with Vibrance. I guess my only question is I'd love to sit down and talk with Christian. Not really. And I don't think, but I wonder why he decided to split up the opinion on two different entries. Like, I wonder why he didn't do the try bet on entry one, the exacta bet on entry one, and the win bet, the $250 win bet on Vibrance on entry one. I wonder what the thought was on splitting it up between the two. Nonetheless, a brilliant way to maximize a 30-1 shot.
Well, one thing that struck me about the entries, and I wasn't going to go here yet in the conversation because I do want you, JK, to point out some plays that impressed you, and we'll get to that question. But I'll be honest, one thing that struck me is how having two entries really is letting some. You'd never have it where you had a contest, the aesthetics of having a contest where a group of players buy in for $15,000 and then and other players buy in for $7,500. I don't think you'd ever have that set up. But there's really no difference at all between that and what this is. I just don't think there's a compelling reason at this point in time, with contests established and on the precipice of making a big jump in popularity, other than a money grab. What reason is there to have multiple entries in a live bankroll contest? You really, I feel like looking through these plays, I really see the unfairness of that. And I really think, and I'm not just saying this because the contest format we created, JK, and the World Horse Players Tour has an alternative to this, but I really don't think that the two entries versus one is fair, and I'd like to see the contest world try to move away from it. What do you think?
I agree. Would likely affect my my ROI because I feel like I can effectively play with the two. But I agree. It was a conversation that we brought up on the wagering committee. It was a conversation that will be brought up again. There were some timing issues that kind of nipped it in the bud from even being a conversation. And full disclosure, some people had already qualified. So to move the goalposts like that much at the point when we were would have been a problem. Like I said, it'll be another conversation we'll have about it. I agree with you. The optics are one guy buys in for $15,000, the other one buys in for $7,500, and so you're rewarding the guy who can buy in for more, which I don't think is what these contests want to be about. I'd have no problem with him going to one entry. I understand why it's not one entry. We'll see what happens moving forward.
You brought up also the idea that some players aren't playing to win. I don't necessarily think that's a mistake. And Pat, I want to get your opinion about this. If it's your wagering personality that you're comfortable wagering this amount of money over Breeders' Cup weekend, you're someone who loves betting these races, is going to bet a lot on these races, is interested in the NHC, I don't have a problem with the idea of going there with the goal of getting top 15 and taking home a little money and getting an NHC seat. It seems like JK is a little bit judgy about the guys who aren't in there necessarily to go for the win. How do you feel looking through these plays, Pat? What percentage of players does it look to you are really trying to win? And I see the point of playing anyway, and then just being eligible to participate for the prize pool, even if you're not going for broke. What's your view on it as a little bit more of a Contest World outsider?
I think you have to look at it as you're playing for the prize pool. You're not playing for a 1 in 600-700 chance to win a little more money. That's just a general take. It's certainly nice. It's a bit of a consolation to get an NHC entry out of it. I think that's all well and good. But if you are invested in these races, there's a lot of what we would otherwise consider money added to this, and the prize pool. If you can get yourself in the top 15, I think that's what people need to be shooting for. I don't think I just want another chance to get a lifeline where I have what we would really call a 600, 700 to 1 chance to win a much bigger prize in a very different style contest, in a very kind of grind fashion. I don't buy that as much. I think you got to look at this as playing this contest to increase the bankroll, to try and get to a point where you are winning money on top of whatever your bankroll is. And that's it. Now, not everybody plays that way, okay? Everybody has different motivations, and that's why I don't necessarily agree with some of the wide sweeping generalizations from player A opining on the way that player D or E or F is playing, because it is just a fact of life that different people have different motivations with this. If you earned your way, if you won your way into this tournament and you say, I could really use the $7,500, then I'm going to maybe put myself in a position to mess around with some show bets, and maybe I'll qualify, or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just try and take the money as best I can. Whatever. Okay, yeah, so be it. Those we're not all the same. Any person that plays in this contest is going to come into it with different motivations. That has to be respected. But we can't look at those plays as indicative of a style or a preference or that player A was playing in a fashion that player B would say is absolutely outrageous. They're coming at it from different perspectives. So I just don't think we can paint with a wide swath. When you look at the people who are regular contest players, which is, obviously it's a smaller number than the total that we're playing in the BCBC. I think that's where you really get the meat and potatoes of this data and what it's really suggesting and what you can learn from it. I don't think you're going to learn from it from somebody who's just playing it just for fun or because they want an entry. That's all well and good, but I don't think you're going to learn from that.
Yeah, I kind of agree. To a certain extent, I guess, to not weigh ourselves down on this, I just feel like if you're playing for 15th just to get an NHC seat, then you should probably just play through the tote and find a cheaper opportunity to get that NHC seat, right? It's like, play in the Keeneland contest or play at Hawthorne or play at Santa Anita or Express Bet, one of those contests with the Santa Anita or whatever. Play on DRF tournaments and try to qualify into some. I just don't see spending $10,000 to try to get 15th.
In my example, it was somebody who was going to be betting the money anyway. So I'm saying if you're going to be betting that money anyway for cash, I have no problem participating in the prize pool as well and potentially getting my my NHC seat then for $2,500 essentially if I have a good weekend.
Well, that's a very good point. In general, I think that if you're going to have an individual person or you're going to have a group of people who are going to be betting, say, $1,500, $2,000, $2,500 over the course of the 2 days, why not come together, have a contest entry, and play it? That is, I think that's the great thing about this contest. I think it's what makes it very attractive, that you're talking about some of the best races of the year, big fields, lots of opportunity, big results, And it just adds another dimension of a really fun and engaging approach to horse racing that you're not going to find day in and day out. This is a way to really engage people, and that's why I think by putting the plays out, as much as it may potentially embarrass a couple people, which again I don't buy, I think the engagement factor of this, others are going to look at it who've been sitting on the sidelines and say, you know what, yeah, I can do this. I can be a part of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's why in the long term, this will be very, very net positive for BCBC, the Breeders' Cup as a whole, and wagering.
There is a demystifying element of it when you see a player like Ed Abel, who played great, gets there with win and place bets. You could make a case. I was going over some math with Sean Borman about a parlay if you chose the right couple of favorites, what you could do with a bet as simple as that. JK, who's somebody whose play impressed you throughout this tournament?
I think some people might think this is a cop-out, but honestly, if you look at it, you'll agree with me. And I'm sure all three of us could have given the same answer, but I'm always mystified when I look at Nick Tamero's plays and sitting with him and him being a friend of mine. If you want to learn a little bit more about, ticket construction, obviously you should read Pete and Mike Maloney's book, Betting with an Edge. But outside of that, if you want to, in this contest, if you want to see someone betting efficiently and really maximizing your opinion in ticket construction, I think Nick Tamero does a phenomenal job. Just the way that he bets tries, and the way that he bet the newspaper of record race. It wasn't his biggest score, but he picked up like $5,000 by using her with 3 horses in third, and just and doubles and exact. He doesn't have. There's not a club that he doesn't have in his bag, and so just looking through his plays. If you still have the PPs printed out, I'd pull the PPs out and just really kind of follow what he did. I've always been impressed with Nick, and what he did last weekend or 2 weekends ago still was pretty sharp, hitting for 26,000, hitting the exacta in the Classic with he bet 8,000 in the race, pulled out 26,000, and was betting exactas and tries and all kinds of good stuff.
And with a secondary opinion winning, I think, too, which to me is another thing that shows how well
Absolutely.
Those tickets are constructed.
Yeah, he was really heavy on McKenzie West Coast and Yoshida, but he understood the likelihood of Accelerate still running well, and he instead of boxing it or he structured a bunch of bets around that situation, and he ended up ultimately hitting. I think he hit a $200 exacta with Accelerate and Gunnevera for 26,000.
It's one thing that really strikes me looking through all the plays, and I want to get to a couple more players for you guys to call out things that you either learned or weren't impressed by. But the ability to hold more than one thought in your head at the same time when writing tickets, I think it's on evidence here a lot, and those plays are a great example where I think if you talk to him privately about Accelerate's chances, he wouldn't have been very sanguine, and yet recognizing that when you've got these prices to run in underneath, it just doesn't cost all that much to say, hey, well, what if I'm wrong about that part of my opinion and right about this other part of my opinion? Why can't I still get paid? Now, no conversation about this year's Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge would be complete without giving props to the winner, Chuck Grubbs. I know we talked about Chuck elsewhere, but his tickets were very interesting to look at. Classic, what I would call double keys, that got the job done, which is again just a powerful tool that you can use to really maximize when you're very right about a race. I want to make sure we get his name on this podcast at least that extra time. Pat, how about you? Something else you saw that impressed you throughout the 2 days?
Well, I'll give you kind of both sides of it, Pete. First was the playing. Sometimes if you have a really strong opinion about a horse that you think is going to dominate a race, this is your horse. Why not just be betting it to win? I think there were a couple examples of some players who played across the board, which I thought it became, there was a, if you were so strong that one horse was going to run well, that you could really maximize that opinion if you were right by betting to win, as opposed to reducing the value of that opinion by betting an equal amount to place or show. I think that has to kind of come into consideration, and is maybe a lesson that people could learn out of the contest. I looked at the play of Marshall Graham. I mean, to think that Marshall was basically down to his last like $700 going into the distaff, and he hits a $360 exacta that he played with Monomoy Girl over Wildcat. That was pretty much all. That was his only bet in the race. He had bet another horse. He bet Abel Tasman over Wildcat as well for the same amount. He was running low, and suddenly he wins $6,700 off of that. He takes a chunk of that and bets doubles, going into using Magical, going into McKinsey and West Coast. But he knew, I want to have roughly $5,000 to bet this classic. And he bet it incredibly efficiently. His opinion was very clear. Gunnevera somewhere in the mix, second or third. And he more or less played 5 horses in exactas with Gunnevera coming second. His main opinion was McKinsey and West Coast. He had a secondary opinion, which was Mind Your Biscuits and Accelerate. And then he had a tertiary opinion, which was Thunder Snow, Pavel, and Yoshida. And he structured it very clearly. He had $800 exactas McKinsey West Coast with Gunnevera, $400 exactas Mind Your Biscuits and Accelerate with Gunnevera, and then that third opinion was $200 exactas of Thunder Snow, Pavel, and Yoshida over Gunnevera. And, the opinion was solely, if Gunnevera runs second, I need one of these 7 horses to be in the mix. He also played trifectas using Gunnevera only in third, but he knew, he didn't have the ability to spread as much within the confines there, and so he had to kind of limit himself to only McKinsey and West Coast in that first position. So it was very well structured, very tight play, a little different than Christian Helmer's. He very rarely went to the trifecta play, whereas Christian almost exclusively was residing in the trifecta zone. Marshall played very differently, very tight, very efficient and focused, which is what you would expect from an economist, I think. and it worked out for him by getting that $400 exacta in the last and maximizing an opinion on a 30-1 chance in a $5 million race. I thought that was a really well constructed effort from someone who was basically teetering on empty with 3 races to go.
And help me repeat one of my favorite jokes when contest leaderboards come up a certain way and I get to point out, is this the leaderboard? Is this a list of people who are in my kitchen at Saratoga? So always good to see Marshall doing well for sure. We talked earlier about how you're going to see a lot more, correctly, according to game theory, aggressiveness in these contests. And some people, it just bewilders them. I saw comments on Twitter specifically about legendary sports writer and horse player Dick Girardi and his decision to make an aggressive move. I think it was an all-in move on Marley's Freedom on the second day and ending up busting out. And some uninformed person said something to the effect of, who would bet that kind of money on a 4-5 shot? And to me, it's a brilliant play. Coming into that day, the idea of being aggressive early when most people are going to be playing minimums or sitting on their hands, the idea to be super aggressive there after the day Baffert had on the Friday, we didn't know how the rest of Saturday was going to go. It seemed like it might just be one of these times where he was cycling up, and I would have told you ahead of the day that was as likely a winner as anybody, because you got to remember, it's not betting 48,000 on 4-5. If he hits that bet, he's in the prize pool, quite possibly in the top 5. So you have to factor in the extra 50,000 or so he's going to get when he makes that play. I just want people to understand this. And JK, there is nobody, unless we could pull Dick Girardi onto the call. We do need to have him on the show at some point. But there's nobody better to ask about this type of thing, this ability to fearlessly bet a lot of money on a short-priced horse than you, given the way that you made your big wager with every single dollar running through Enable in the turf. I want you to talk about, I'll let you answer the question for yourself that 17 people have asked me. What did JK do? What was his strategy going into the final double on the 2 days?
Well, to the point about Dick's bet, and like you said, the uninformed questioning of that. Look, I mean, based on the win pool, the horse was about 50% to win. You know, just taking all things into account. That's a little Eric Bialik math. Maybe it's a little bit less than 50%.
JK tries math fails?
No, Eric Bialik. I went to Eric with these math questions. About 50%. If he would have hit the bet, he was going to be at about 80,000-ish. And like you said, he would have been in the lead with a shot of winning $300,000, but at least shooting for the clouds, landing in the clouds, getting second or third, picking up some money. So essentially, he was taking a 4 to 5 even money risk for a 3 to 1, 4 to 1 return on his money. I have no problem with that. It's the same approach that I took with the race that I took at the end. Eric's done some rough math. I was about 3 to 1 to hit that bet. That was to hit Enable and to catch one of the 4 horses that I use in the Classic: McKenzie, West Coast, Mind Your Biscuits, and Yoshida. So I was 3 to 1.
Before the turf, you were 3 to 1.
Before the turf. 3 to 1 before the turf. And then after the turf, I was about 50% to hit it, but there's nothing I could do at that point. I was already in. To win $450,000. Risked 40 to win 450. I was a 3 to 1 proposition, and I was getting 10 to 1 for a 3 to 1 proposition. If you can turn this game, whether it's on a Saturday at Aqueduct or a Monday at Parks, if you can get 10 to 1 for 3 to 1 propositions, you can be a winning horse player. It's just that simple. And that's why I love contests. I can play things that my brain likes to play, which is things that I like to identify which favorites are most likely to win and build my stuff around them. And then you can get to propositions like that. And so that was my approach. My approach was I wanted to risk the whole 40 with an opportunity to get north of 100. I'm still not convinced. I'm sure I can look at Robin's spreadsheet. I'm not convinced I would have won because I think a lot of other people would have scored as well. I mean, there's some other, I'm sure someone had big money on Yoshida, and depending on who would have ran second to Yoshida, would that have been enough? And But you can't predict those things. I wanted to get north of 100. I was set up to get north of 100. I don't regret it. If I would have added 2 more horses, they would not have been Accelerate. They would have been Gunnevera and Mendelssohn. I was never going to get there. That was the logic behind it, was to maximize it using the prize pool to supplement whatever I would have won through the tote.
We talked about this the other day.
And this is an important point.
You go ahead, Pat.
Guys, it's a very important point that even if you're not right, if you're playing it well, if you are structuring it appropriately to get yourself in a position, it's more than half the battle. Okay, you need to be exercising your opinions as intelligently as possible, and getting in that position to be right. And if you can do that, if you can structure appropriately, then that is that it's just intelligent play. And there was one time I was looking at the Nick Tamaro plays. He basically ended up with an opinion, or he ended up on his second entry playing in a mile. He did not like Catapult at all. He loved Expert Eye and Analyze It. And everything was structured around those 2 horses. And across his 2 entries, he played roughly $4,000, and he walked away from the race with $4,050 in winnings. He had 0 interest in Catapult, but he still walked away breaking even on the race because of the smart structure of his tickets, that if a horse he didn't like happened to come in, he would end up with almost a break-even result. and then he would have those bullets to then go fight in the next race. And it's those sorts of things, those opinions, the Dick Girardi play. He went very big on Marley's freedom, but he still had bullets and he still had kind of action to play some strong opinions as the contest continued. It just would have gotten a little different if maybe she had saved some ground and gotten a bit of a better trip. But that's what just makes this insight and this data so fascinating.
It is great to look at, and even haters of the all button, such as ourselves, can see how in the right combination, when you're not spending much to be able to use, I don't know, did Nick use an all or was it a modified all in that middle spot? Pat, do you know off the top of your head?
No, it looks like it was an all.
Yeah.
But see, the thing is, Nick will use an all not as his main play. He'll use it as his like secondary or third play, which is like why he hit the take charge brandy trifecta when he did so well in the Breeders' Cup. He was keying. Pat's gonna know better than I am. The 10 horse that day, which was who was that, Pat?
Wonder Gal, maybe.
Yeah, and then one from the East Coast. It doesn't matter at this point, I guess.
There were 4 horses. 4 horses that he keyed in the juvenile fillies.
Right. So he had stronger. He spends more money on the things that are more likely to happen. Then he'll throw in kind of a saver to the opinion if something chaotic happens, using the all button as a third or fourth measure, not ever as a first or second measure.
The other thing I wanted to point out was we talked about this in the show the other day. Another not well-informed person. Well, why didn't JK? Why didn't he just Accelerate was going to be the favorite? Why didn't he just use the favorite? Well, when you're constructing Dutch type tickets like that, you don't have the ability to just use the favorite. They'll suck up so much of the money that you're betting that your overall equity goes down, and you don't have enough on the combinations that you actually like. You've got to take stands somewhere, and I think JK, your bets showed that. Don't even bother to comment on that. We talked about it the other day, and it's pretty straightforward. I do want to give you each the opportunity, and you don't name names here, but a play that you guys saw that you didn't like or didn't understand along the way. JK, we'll start with you.
I mean, look, if you're betting a 7-horse exacta box and it's not the first, trifecta box, and it's not the first Saturday in May, like, you're wrong. Like it's just such a poorly constructed situation. I don't care if you think there's going to be chaos. Take the time to construct a ticket to better represent your opinion of chaos rather than, whatever. An 8x9 by all trifecta is slightly obnoxious if it's the first Saturday in May and there's 20 horses in the gate. If you're going to play this game, you've got it. It's not about picking the horses. It's about picking the horses and then structuring your wagering and your opinion in an intelligent way. You got to be a little sharper than that.
Some would throw in, and I know JK, you don't necessarily play that way, but I still have plenty of sympathy for the point of view that you're at the end of the day you're not even playing horses, you're playing prices. But that's a conversation for another day. Pat, something you saw in the ticket structure of the competitors at this year's BCBC that you didn't like or thought you could learn something about what not to do from?
Yeah, I completely agree with Jonathan there that it's the 5-horse boxes, the 5-horse exacta boxes from players who don't even look like they're trying to preserve bankroll or, that are trying to it's not like they're just trying to pull money out of the contest. Maybe if they had won an entry, this looks like it was active play and just thinking this is what I'm going to do. And the shame of it is to think that, there was somebody who played a $50 exacta box that included Enable and Magical. And they bet $600 on the race and they won $402.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I just, what's the point? But straight up and down through their contest play, they were basically playing multi-horse exacta boxes as the majority of their play. These are the types of people who I think will really benefit from the data being released. And it could, I hope that this has the effect of making these contests all the more engaging, more competitive, and will someone will look at this and say, gosh, look at the way that these guys, say in the top 10, 15, for the majority of them, the way in which they're playing, and learn a lot from that approach, as opposed to, 5-horse exacta boxes with the second and third choices, or the first and fourth choices in the mix there. That's just not going to do what you need to have happen here in this contest.
JK, sounded like you had something
one
to
other thing I
on.
also wanted to note, Pete.
Please.
Going into the Classic, 9 of the top 15 were already what we'd call in the money. They were already in the prize pool. There were 6 people who were out of what ended up being the top 15, ended up vaulting over other players to get into that point. And I thought that was interesting. I think that's a function of Accelerate winning the race, mostly, that the favorite won. But the thing I noticed is, and Jonathan, I think, alluded to this earlier, that if Yoshida, if Mendelssohn, if Thunder Snow had won, if that Drosselmeyer-like price had won the Classic, I think the entire top 15 probably gets turned on its head, and it looks, incredibly different. But that's just kind of the dynamics of how a favorite impacts these sorts of things.
Pete, we learned that lesson. We learned that lesson with the Belmont Stakes challenge, where I was really high and I thought that something crazy was going to happen, and it didn't, to a certain extent. Something likely, and it just kind of stayed, where I thought that it was going to kind of get flipped upside down, like Pat mentioned. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen in those situations, but I think you have to have your opinion. You shoot your shot, and you try to do it efficiently and intelligently. I think that if you're going to play in these contests, the most important thing I took away from it is you just, there's a better way to do things than multiple horse boxes. Kind of. And I just, just take some time and wheel the bet a little bit and just do something to maximize your opinion. You're going to be wrong a lot more than you're right. And when you're right, you have to make money. And if you're inefficiently betting and just kind of casting a wide net, it's just not going to happen. When
you say wheel a little bit, I think what you really mean is weight your combinations a little bit and wheel a little and take some horses out. Yes? Even
at a base, but here's the thing is, if you are a box better at the moment, let's crawl before we walk. And at least wheel. If you're wheeling, you're at least not wasting combinations on things that are a lot less likely to happen. And then the next step, obviously,
you're not using wheel the way that key is what you mean.
I don't know, Pat. I think it's wheel. I mean, there's a W
take one
on the
horse,
thing, and then,
one horse, and put all the horses in the other. That's a wheel. That's what you're telling people to do.
No. I've always thought of wheel.
I see where the confusion's coming in, because in the way in which the plays are there, they've got a wheel when really they do mean key. That a horse is being used in a top position or in a single position with multiple horses in another position.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is taking one horse and then using that one horse with selected other horses.
I'm suggesting an exacta 1 with 2-3, and then you can flip it 2-3 with 1. Gotcha. You're better off doing that than boxing 1-2-3.
Absolutely. The problem is with the term. I don't think that's what a wheel is, but it's boring for the audience, so we'll talk about that another time. I've got. I'm glad we clarified, though, because someone who had my interpretation would be like, "What is he talking about?" But now I understand, and I agree. It's trying to have more of an opinion, A, and then B, write bets that accurately reflect that opinion. I have 5 takeaways I've just been writing as you guys have talked. I want to just get to these, get a final thought from each of you guys. Pat, we're going to have to bring you back to talk about the white paper, because we've already kept you over time today. So I promise you we will do that. But I just want to give us each an opportunity to provide some more stuff. Based on this conversation, now some of this stuff is old enough that it's in my book when I wrote The Winning Contest Player from 5 years ago, writing about live bank play. Some of these ideas I think are refined, and they're just some of the ideas I get reviewing these plays. One is, we'll start with this. You've got to treat this money. If you want to win the contest and participate in the full equity value of the situation, you've got to treat the money like funny money. It is a live bank contest, but in your mind, it should be just like chips in a poker tournament, and that's the level of aggressiveness with which you need. At the same time, you can't discount the fact that all you need is a chip and a chair. We gave the Marshall Graham example. Alan Harburg, I think even a better example, was down to a puny amount on one entry and ends up participating in the prize pool. So you can't rule that idea out, and that speaks to the outsized importance of the last race in live bank contests, particularly this live bankroll contest, which I think every year except 2015 was decided in the last race. And even in 2015, there was one placing away of a cold trifecta from Tommy Massis actually being eclipsed in there. If for certain players, for a lot of players, saving something for the last race historically has done very well in this contest. And then two other thoughts. One, to me, playing one entry in this contest as currently constituted, it's a bit like taking a knife to a gunfight. You can win. You're not going to maximize your chance of winning. And then the final thing I'll say, and this one is a little more abstract because it didn't really come to play as much in this contest, but I do think it's a thought worth sharing, is that just like in mythical contests, in a live bankroll contest, points that no one else has are worth more than points that a lot of people are going to have. And ultimately, to me, that speaks to why the Dick Girardi play, even though it didn't work out, was so good, and JK, why your play of being so aggressive on Enable, one of the most obvious favorites of the 2 days, still made a lot of sense, because in the universe, in the ecosystem of the contest, you're getting a lot more. So those are just some thoughts that I have. I just wanted to spill them out there for folks to disagree with, agree with, chew on, whatever you want to do. And before we get out of here, I'll give each of you guys just a chance for a final thought. It could be in any realm, whether it's another player you want to call out, a comment on what I've just said, etc. And Pat, we'll start with you.
I would say, Pete, the only thing I would maybe disagree with is the two entry point, because I believe of the top 45 players that I believe only 5 or 6 had two entries.
It's pretty impressive.
Now, that's not it's not entirely indicative, because there are plenty of people that have two entries that are going all in at the end, et cetera. And correct. I think you really need to look at that as who in the top 15 had multiple entries. But this is, I think, what the Breeders' Cup has done for this contest, how it's developed, how it's grown. I think it needs to be used as an example for the rest of the world, particularly those jurisdictions that are looking to maybe inspire some play within their tote pools, to do it around their big events. It is so fun to watch it unfold, to know people who are in the contest, friends who may participate with other friends. It's just an incredibly engaging, exciting effort. I think it's good for the sport. And this sort of exposition after the fact makes it all the more engaging. And I do think, and I hope that for the NHC, whatever steps that are possible that can be done to reveal plays soon after they've happened so that people can really kind of follow along, that makes it a more engaging endeavor overall for the sport. For the people that haven't qualified, for the people that wish they qualified, it's just fun. And it goes to a greater point about racing in general that we need to open up to a much greater extent. We need to be much more transparent. It's part of what our organization wants to do. As you mentioned, we'll talk about the white paper later on, but it's about access to information and details and data. These things can be very engaging, and it's a tremendous example of that.
JK, a final thought from you.
This contest reminded me, and this information being released reminded me of a lesson that I think we've all tried to learn or had to learn along the way, which is that we were introduced to this sport by the attractive nature of like getting the puzzle right and finding who's going to cross the wire first and then who's going to be second and third. And although that is a very important aspect of it, it's more, you're going to be wrong in those situations more than you're right. And it's turned into the important part being how you leverage that opinion. We spend, hours and hours, and pre-entries come out and people are printing and handicap, and then they construct their wager as they're walking to the window. And it's just so fundamentally incorrect. And I just encourage you to find people who you respect, and maybe you won't respect after you thought you did after you look at their plays. But there's a guy, Nick Tamero I talked about, Garrett Skiba, one of the best live bankroll players in the history, if not the best. I looked at his plays and just a lot of real attempts at just direct hits. And being able to stomach those losses along the way because you believe in the process and you understand it just takes one. I think you can learn a lot from that. I think too many guys and gals are concerned with being right. And it's not about being right all the time. It's about being right once or twice.
I like it, and I agree with all of that. Hey, one follow-up. When we had Robin on before, it didn't actually mention how to get the spreadsheet. I sort of implied that you can find it at his Twitter, at Robin Howlett, and you can, but you can also get it via horseracingdatasets.com, and that's spelled exactly like you think it is, horseracingdatasets.com. Definitely want to have Robin back on the show. Pat, we're going to have you back on sooner rather than later. We'll talk about that when we close here. But gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time today. Thanks to Robin Howlett as well, producer Craig, of course, Willie Nile for the theme song. For more of his music, check out willienile.com, and our friend Travis Stone as well for providing that VO at the top. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatal. We will be back on Friday. May you win all your photos.